All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here. This is Behind the Book with David Hoover with his book 100 Years of Glory, 1921 to 2021, Dobyns-Bennett Football. We're here with the Friends of the Library, and thank you for being here. So, all right, Coach, I know you've been researching this book for a long time. Can you tell us about how you came to be interested in this topic and how the book came to be?
Well, back in the 1980s, I was working on a master's degree in history at East Tennessee State University. And I decided to write a thesis, which basically at that time, in the history program, you either had to write a thesis or you had to write 3 designated papers. And I was kind of intrigued by the challenge of doing a thesis. So I got it approved to write a book on the social development of Kingsport from 1921 to 1934 in connection with the high school football program when Leroy Sprinkle was the head coach. And I had to combine the history with what was going on with the football program at that time. And in doing it, I really enjoyed doing it. I mean, it was a challenge. And at the end, I decided to make the thesis into a book, as I had plenty of pictures. I thought I had a good story as far as what happened with the football program from 1921 to 1934. And at that time, even I was thinking, doing the whole history of the DB program someday would really be neat. And the problem is, it takes a long time to do that. and I really needed to wait until I retired before having the time that was needed to put into that. So I retired 4 years ago, and after enjoying retirement for about 6 months or so, like a lot of people who retire, you kind of get a little bit anxious. You're looking for something to motivate you. It's like a friend told me one time. He said, "Well, after you've slept late and read the paper and drank your coffee, what do you do at 9:30?" And it made me think a little bit, and I decided to do this, to write a book on the entire history of the Dobyns-Bennett football program, and immediately went into it. I did a lot of research over. It took about a year to do online research of newspaper articles dealing with the program, and there I used the public library quite a bit for that with their online editions. And then, of course, I had to go into interviewing people, and I interviewed about 110 people who either played or coached or were supporters of the program, townspeople, even opposing coaches. And then, of course, I had to write the paper. And that was, the whole process took about 3 years to do that.
Right.
But it was a lot of work and time, but yet that's one of the beauties of retirement, is that you have time to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's really what led me into it.
Now, how did the process differ writing this book versus working on your thesis in the previous book? Obviously, technology's changed for research purposes.
Yeah, the thesis was a very difficult thing to do. It took me off and on about 5 years.
Wow.
From doing the research, the interviews, the writing. The toughest thing about that was getting the writing approved by my thesis committee. Now, the beauty of writing a book as opposed to a thesis is you don't have 3 people sitting there going over every word that you've written to see if it's, flows the way they want it to. That'd be a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
But in writing a book, it's a little bit different. It's your own thing, but yet at the same time, my publisher had proofreaders who read it and suggested changes, and I went along with that. And then I went through the book itself and noticed mistakes that I had made or things that I'd do differently. And that was a difficult thing, but I felt like with writing the book, I was more under control. I was more under my control, as opposed to depending on someone else who ideas about how to word something or whatever may have been more different maybe than the way I was doing it, the way I was writing my book itself. So really, that was the big difference.
You weren't getting graded.
Yeah, this is for a fairly important grade. You don't make an A on your thesis, you don't get the master's degree.
Yeah.
So, I felt a lot of pressure with that. And
sure.
Of course, the thing was different too. When I wrote the thesis and worked on my master's, I was teaching full time and I was coaching full time. And it was finding the time to do it all that was a real problem. I was a lot more relaxed writing my book because I wasn't staying up at night. I was getting my 8 hours sleep, and the pressure was not as intense, even though I did give myself 3 years. I was determined to finish this book by the fall of this year because that would be 100 years of DB football. And I felt like the title sounded better, but the most important thing, it made Dobyns-Bennett football unique in that we'd gone 100 years. And I thought people would, they'd focus in a little bit better when you look at it in that fashion.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure, I think our program's been around approximately the same amount of time as the NFL, actually. I looked that up, that I think the 20s was when the NFL was getting started.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
So what did you think was the biggest challenge when writing this book?
Probably the biggest challenge was having the self-discipline to put in the time required. To me, it never was gruesome work. It was just time consuming, but you had to be willing to sit there and look at online accounts of newspapers all day long.
Yeah.
You had to be willing to schedule over 100 interviews and do the interviews, although to me that was the most enjoyable part of the whole thing. And then you had to sit there and try to write the book and make it as interesting as you could. And that was a challenge, but yet at the same time, it's kind of an enjoyable challenge because I felt like I was in control, and that was great. But I guess the most stressful thing was this summer trying to finish it up.
Yeah.
And I was facing deadlines to get it done by the 1st of August because I wanted the book to be out to the public by the beginning of football season. But there were still changes that needed to be made, some proofreading that had to be done. My family took a vacation to Hilton Head the week of the 4th of July. And I swear, the first 2 days I was there, it was sunny, it was beautiful outside. Our whole family's outside enjoying the ocean and the pool. And I'm inside at a table in front of a computer, proofreading my book, making changes. And, but that's just all part of it. You got to do what you had to do. And in the end, it makes you feel better once you get it done, knowing you've sort of paid the price, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. It's a lot of hard work. Got a question from the audience here. Ken asks, he says, he's about 2/3 of the way through your book and really enjoying it. He's learning a lot about past season and also the history of Kingsport. He wants to know, what was the most interesting thing you learned while writing the book that you didn't know?
Wow, that's a good question.
That is a good question.
I knew that there were certain periods of time when Dobyns-Bennett football was better than other periods. The late 1940s, it kind of boggles my mind right now that they won 4 state championships in 5 years. Now, at that time, it was determined by the polls. And I knew they had good years during that period of time, but just in reading about that period of time, how good they were. I think in the 5-year period, they lost 1 game in 1946 to Knox High. And that was kind of an odd game and an odd situation. But, if they'd won that game, they probably would have won 5 state championships in a row. And as it is, DB still has the record for any team in Northeast Tennessee for winning the most consecutive state championships, which is 3. They won it in 45, they won it in 47, 48, and 49.
Okay.
And one thing I kind of guessed, but I found from doing all my research, Dobyns-Bennett, like most schools, has gone through cycles when they were really, really good state contenders, and then they might go through a few years where the talent was down, and they weren't as good. And, you know, people need to realize at the high school level, you can't recruit.
No.
You've got talent that's given to you, and all you can do is to make the best out of it. And there are all kinds of ingredients that go into having a good program. But I guess the one thing that I learned specifically were the years in which they were the greatest, why they were the greatest. And in the book, I was able to get into that deeper when I realized that was the post-war years and industry was booming in Kingsport. And I think that had a definite impact on the kind of kids that they had during that time. And maybe through my research too, I think as industry began to decline in Kingsport, the records in football went down some. Now, not a whole lot, but not state championships.
Sure.
And I was able to draw a parallel there with the work ethic that you get from being a factory town, a mill town, some people called it, as opposed to not being that way as much. So I guess that was one thing that I came to a conclusion with just from my research.
Absolutely. So you said you really enjoyed getting to have those interviews. I'm sure that would be some pretty interesting conversations. Did any of your interviews surprise you?
I guess the thing that most pleased me and maybe surprised me to a certain extent was how honest everybody was in the interviews. I mean, you know, there were times when I asked pretty tough questions, and you know, I wasn't necessarily trying to incite them to say anything or anything like that, but they were very honest in giving their opinions about different things. But I also made up my mind when I began this book, I was not going to put anything unduly critical of a player or a coach. And we might talk, you know, we might discuss in the book how the program went down a certain year or a series of years and why that happened. But I didn't throw out names as far as individuals that, you know, that it was their fault or anything like that. I've been there as a player. I was a baseball player at Dobyns-Bennett, and I've been a coach at Dobyns-Bennett. And, you know, when I played shortstop, I made errors every now and then. I wasn't trying to. And as a coach, sometimes you have to make tough decisions. And sometimes there are some years the talent's not as good as other years. And that's just the way it is. And people need to realize that. But still, I was very pleased that everyone was willing to tell me what their opinions were about the program. And they told me some great anecdotes, funny things that happened, unusual things that happened. And to me, that may be the best part of the book. I mean, I've got stories of who won the games and who the star players were and all that kind of stuff. But what made it more interesting, or what I think makes it more interesting, would be the personalities of the players, the personalities of the coaches, pranks that they pulled on each other, funny things that happened at practice. I mean, it's all that. You know, if you've been involved in high school athletics, like I was, I'll sit back with guys I played with 50 years ago. We'll talk about that stuff. You know, our teams were good. Yeah, we won a lot of games. That was great. But it's the relationships you had with those people that you still have today and talking about the good times that really makes it valuable.
Oh, sure. I think that can be very universally relatable. We've got another question. Do you plan a follow-up book about the history of DB basketball?
Not next week. Not any time immediately. Down the road, I might, but I want to give myself some time to relax a little bit and enjoy doing some other things, fun type things. It's possible. It's possible.
Let yourself get bored a little bit.
Once I get good and bored, I might look at it.
I was curious. I saw, you know, obviously you did interviews and you looked in a lot of newspapers and things like that to get information about the games. Did you have access to any of the video recordings of the football games for your research?
There is a video on YouTube of the 1945 game at J. Fred Johnson Stadium between DB and Knox High. Knox High was our biggest rival at that time. And in those years from 45 to 50, especially whoever won that game, often it helped determine the state championship. Of course, we dominated them during that time, except in '46 when they beat us. But anyway, it was interesting to look at that video and see the fans, see the players, see the formations, the excitement, and so forth. One thing I noticed, people dressed up more back then. Men would have coats and ties on. I mean, you know, nobody wears a tie at a ball game now. Girls, women would have dresses on. I mean, it was just a totally different type setting, but the excitement was the same. And the stories about how big the crowds were at that time is unbelievable. Larger consistently than today, I think. And it was interesting just to see the excitement of the fans as well with that. But I know there are other videos, excuse me, out there and so forth, but just really for a lack of time, I've not.
Oh, sure.
That's the one that I did notice, though.
Yeah, well, that's kind of cool. So how much did the planned nature of Kingsport, you kind of touched on this, but how much did that influence the football program?
I thought it influenced it quite a bit. The city was set up with the idea dating back to J. Fred Johnson in the early 1920s and over the next 30 years or so that we'd be an industrial town. The city fathers would recruit industries to come here. And the way the city was planned out, the industries would be encouraged to come here because we had flat land down near the river, Holston River. It was good land to build on. Then it would be encouraging for people to live here because of the higher land to the north, where you currently have Watauga Street, Linville Street, the 50s. You have had eventually Fair Acres. And then the idea was that in between, you'd have the business section. Everybody used to, I can remember shopping downtown. You didn't have the mall and these other places. But it was a very well-organized town. But I think the emphasis on industries affected football because a lot of Kingsport daddies worked in those factories. And a lot of those jobs were blue-collar jobs. They paid well. The benefits were good. But they required hard work, and that hard work ethic got transferred down to their kids. Their kids grew up tough. They had that blue-collar ethic. And one thing I think that you have to have in football, you have to have toughness. And Kingsport kids, because of the industrial background, had that blue-collar toughness that they got from their daddies. And I might be overemphasizing that to a certain degree, but a lot of my book is based on the fact that Dobyns-Bennett has been unique compared to other high school football programs in this area and compared to other schools in the state. We have the second winningest program in the history of the state of Tennessee. And what makes Kingsport unique, what made Kingsport unique through 100 years is the industry. Through Eastman, Kingsport Press, Board and Mills, the glass plant, Mead. You know, some of them have changed names. Some of them are no longer around. But to me, that made us unique. And I know when J. Fred Johnson and John B. Dennis developed their city, they weren't thinking, well, what can we do to have the best football program in the state of Tennessee? I mean, I know they wanted to win, but I do think the emphasis they put on industry led to us being successful in football.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I think parental involvement is important for any kind of success for kids, you know, whether it's in sports or, you know, academics or whatever they pursue, you know, they've got to have that encouragement at home.
Oh, yeah.
That's an important factor.
Oh, yeah.
So, speaking of the early days, Sprinkle's an interesting figure in our town's history. What would be the biggest differences between coaching in his time and like today?
The most unusual thing about Sprinkle, and he started coaching when he was in his 20s. He was probably about 25, something like that, when he first came to Kingsport, maybe a year or two younger. But he would actually scrimmage with the players.
Oh, wow.
I mean, he would get out there and block. He would tackle. He would demonstrate. That would be unheard of today. The last coach who I've heard actually did that kind of thing. And recent DB fans would remember Rodney Wampler.
Okay, yeah.
Rodney was an All-American running back at Carson Newman back in the early 70s, was hired at DB, and oftentimes he would run halfback on the scout team or quarterback, and he would run over people. He would block people. He would encourage them to hit him. But he was so big and strong, he usually won whatever battle there might have been. But, yeah, in the early history of the town, I think, well, I know with Sprinkle anyway, he was involved physically. And I think when he gave up football coaching, he was about 40 years old. And one of the things mentioned was that age had a factor in keeping him from being as active physically.
Sure.
So that's one thing that would be different than today, certainly.
Yeah. I mean, that seems more like the retirement age for football players now, if you're thinking about it. It makes sense that 40 would be the thing that would
Very true.
Take him out of the game, so to speak. It's kind of funny. Another thing that's different, I found it interesting that in the earlier years, you mentioned a few football players, they came back to Kingsport instead of playing professional football because they could make more money working at Eastman than, being a professional football player. So do you know if the change in professional pay for football was that a gradual thing, or was there a time in history where you could say, whoa, all of a sudden that pay jumped or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Two of the greatest football players in DB history were Al Agate back in the 1930s. I think 1932, 1933, he played during that time. Went to Michigan State, did extremely well. He was offered a pro contract by the Detroit Lions, and he turned it down to take a job as a chemist at Eastman. But the truth was the NFL didn't pay that much money at that time. And then, of course, more recent fans would remember Hal Miller, who was maybe the greatest lineman in DB history. In the late 1940s, he was on some of those teams that won the state championships, was an All-American at Georgia Tech as an offensive tackle, got drafted by the San Francisco 49ers, played his first year, did extremely well, but then he went into the service for a couple of years. The 49ers wanted him back, but he decided instead of playing more football to come back to Kingsport, and he took a position at Eastman.
Yeah.
And with the money that's involved today compared to back then, I don't know if either one of them would have done that. I mean,
yeah, right.
Yeah, there was a tremendous difference, and I can't swear to this, but I think probably the decade where salaries really started to go up quite a bit in the NFL would be like the 1980s.
Okay.
I know I've read stories of players that played in the 60s, maybe the 70s, who had to have part-time jobs in the off-season. But when the salaries went up in the 80s, as the NFL became more popular, let's just put it like that, with the TV money and so forth, that was no longer the case. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense, because, I mean, it would have taken a while. I know that the Super Bowl started in 66 around then. So that would have started really getting the TV interest and all that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we've touched on that, it's not just, the foot, like being physically good, you got to have the drive and stuff to be into football. But how do the academic requirements affect that as a player in the football program?
It was rare that players were ever declared ineligible academically throughout DB history. I mean, through the 100 years of examining DB football, I can't remember right off anybody. Any stars, any notable players being declared ineligible for academic reasons. I know there were cases where that did happen. I remember reading about one year where the coach was concerned because some kids had quit, some people might have joined the service, some people were academically ineligible. So it did happen. But it's rare that happened. And I know there are rules today that are set by the TSSAA, but it's very rare that anybody's ineligible today. We have so many programs today, especially designed to help kids who are struggling, that it's rare that happens. And that's pretty much the case, I think. And it was rare that it happened in the past as well, just for my research. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like it'd almost be like a positive relationship to have, the success in sports and academically. It would just kind of push you to do well in both. Maybe just kind of get that attitude in the right place.
That's one benefit of athletics. You learn discipline. You learn to take orders. And that carries over into the academics. I know when I taught DB with my AP US history classes, I had a lot of band students.
Oh, sure.
They were very good students, and I'm convinced part of the reason was because the discipline being demanded by their band instructors. And they learn to take orders. They learn discipline. They learn you have to work hard to be successful. And that's true in athletics, any kind of extracurricular activity where you have that type of situation. And that's why I think it's so important for kids today to be involved in something besides just 8 o'clock to 3 o'clock.
Yeah, just it gets you motivated. It gets you, time management skills, just all the different elements, I think, for success. Yeah. Have the age requirements for players changed over time? Because I noticed you mentioned the age a little bit sometimes.
Yeah. In the late 1940s, when we were winning all those state championships, the maximum age allowed for players to play was 20 years old. And it was mentioned that there were some DB players, their senior year, they were 20 years old, and they actually would take semesters off in order to fulfill, in order to graduate at a later age. And sometimes they'd end up being 20 years old. I mean, you had to put in a certain number of semesters to graduate.
Right.
But you could actually take semesters off regardless of how that made you older. And I know there was one year we had a team, I think it's one of those late 40 teams that went to Miami, Florida and played a team. And they complained a little bit, said, well, our oldest players are 19 years old and your oldest players are 20. Of course, I don't know. But of course, we pointed out, you got 2,000 and some students and we got 600, I mean, you rationalize all that. But yeah, it was different now. Of course, now the state requirement is you have to go 8 consecutive semesters.
Okay.
You can't take semesters off just to be older or get a job or, train, whatever. So yeah, that's something that's a little bit different. And I think the maximum age today is 18.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's different.
So I guess if you want to get ahead physically, you just got to start working out in middle school.
Well, that's, of course, you wonder what age is the proper age to start lifting weights, but there are things you can do in conditioning beginning with that age group that can make a difference later on.
Oh, sure. And I'm sure since the beginning of the program, we've made great advances in exercise science since then. So conditioning's changed.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Here was a little interesting snippet in there. You mentioned that the school's was called Little Notre Dame or something, and it said Coach Bowers changed the football uniform color. You can't just do that now, right? Is that regulated, like what color your uniform has to be? Or
well, you can do whatever you want to do as long as the administration approves it.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of a simple answer, but that was interesting when Coach Bowers did that because he succeeded Ed Shockey, who had won 2 state championships in 1945 and 1947. And he'd been head coach for 4 years. He was extremely successful and he was extremely popular. Well, they brought in Coach Bowers from out of town, so to speak. I think he'd been in North Carolina and been in Virginia for a year. And I can kind of understand his thinking in that, it's tough to succeed someone as successful as Coach Bowers. So maybe I need to do something a little different. And he knew he had great material, at least for a couple of years. So he had DB dress out in green and gold uniforms, very similar to Notre Dame. Now, Notre Dame in the late 40s was the most prestigious college football team in the country. And, the idea of Dobyns-Bennett's Little Notre Dame. And he thought that would appeal to the people here in Kingsport who had big enough, I don't want to say egos, but they were carried away with the success of their own program, that this would make us even that much more unique and, maybe help his popularity, that kind of thing. I doubt if other schools, I wonder what they thought about the whole thing. But yeah, there were 2 or 3 years we wore those green uniforms. And I thought it was a little strange. I guess I'm a traditionalist, so I like maroon and gray.
Yeah.
The only other color I see sometimes teams use now, even though it's not a school color, is black. Mm-hmm. I've seen Science Hill with black uniforms. I kind of wonder about that. And that seems to be a popular color for high school, college teams, and some NFL teams every now and then will go to that, just because it's a popular color with football fans.
Yeah. And you have to contrast the other team, I guess, to make it easy to see the difference on the field. Yeah.
Have to do that, yeah.
So that's why you'd have like maroon shirts or like gray shirts or whatever to, I guess, contrast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I like the maroon and gray better too. So I'm going to agree with you on that one. Part of it's because my parents went to Purdue, so
Oh, okay.
I can't. I'm not allowed to like the green and yellow. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, is there a great deal of pressure for these high school coaches to produce results? Is there a financial consequence or incentive for that kind of producing results?
Through my research, excuse me, there's always been pressure to win if you're a head coach at DB. That comes because of the tradition, because of the success, because every school has fans, especially in a town the size of Kingsport, who care. Football is such a popular sport. It's the thing to do on Friday night from a social standpoint, to go watch Dobyns-Bennett play. The pressure's always been there. I go back to Leroy Sprinkle. He didn't want to give up the football coaching job in 1934, but he was pressured to do so. And this guy was an icon. Everybody respected him so much, but he was also an outstanding basketball coach and baseball coach. Mm-hmm. And, the city, the administrators felt like, for the good of the school and because of the added work with more and more students, that, that was the best thing to do. And, throughout the years, there's always been pressure. And I think the success they had early on in the late 30s, 1935 to 1940, they were tremendously successful. They were state contenders. Then when they didn't do well in the early 40s, the head coaches were in trouble. And we go through these cycles where, you have good talent, and sometimes the talent's not as good. But I think I've seen coaches who were tremendously successful, and then they have a year or two where they're not as successful and they're getting criticism. And I just think that's grossly unfair. You're either good at what you do or not as good as what you do. But if you've had success, then there's a reason for that. And I think sometimes people need to take a scientific look at why teams are not successful instead of just an emotional look. It's always easier to blame everything on one person than it is the whole program itself, and mainly the talent of the players. That's really what it's all about. More than anything.
There's a lot of moving parts there.
Yeah.
Something, you mentioned the 40s there, and I thought it was interesting to see, because I'm big into history, how major events in history impact things like football. So the major events I noticed, of course, there's various wars, but then here in town, there's the Eastman explosion. And then, of course, there was school integration. So what sort of impact did these major events have on the football program?
They had a big impact. World War II affected everybody, but it really affected Dobyns-Bennett as well. We had players who were 18 who left the program, left high school because they got drafted. We had kids who were 17 and who were good football players still in high school, but if their parents agreed they could go ahead and join the service, they would join, and the parents would approve it. But to be fair, that affected everybody the same. There was one year, it might have been 1943, Tennessee High canceled their season. They had so few players. But one thing that helped DB as far as the football program, and I think it was 1944, Holston Ordnance, which made ammunition for the war, hired a tremendous number of people. And of course, a lot of those daddies had kids who eventually became football players or were football players at the time. They moved in from elsewhere. And I think that probably helped spur the success of the late 40s. So the war certainly had an effect upon that. The Eastman explosion in 1960 had an impact, I think. That happened on a Tuesday. 16 workers at Eastman were killed. Mm-hmm. That next Friday, we went to DB played at Roanoke Jefferson and lost the game. And it ended up, we won the state championship anyway, but Roanoke Jefferson had an outstanding program. And, we may have lost the game anyway. And I interviewed one player. I said, did the Eastman explosion have an impact on that game as far as your focus? Mm-hmm. And he said, no, we just got beat. Mm-hmm. But, you do have to wonder.
When your whole house is shifted off its foundation, that'd be pretty jarring.
Yeah, that was one of our starting players that happened to.
That was,
As far as integration, it has had an impact. Kingsport has a smaller black population than most cities its size. And we've had some outstanding African-American players. I mean, the Sensabaugh family, my goodness. And we've had so many others who played college football. Some played in the pros, like Teddy Gaines. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, our integration as far as numbers did not benefit us as much as it has in some parts of the state. Mm-hmm. The Murfreesboro schools like Riverdale and Oakland have been very successful and have beaten us several times when we had some of our best teams. They had a larger number of African Americans. Science Hill has more African Americans, very skilled athletes who like to play football. And it's affected Kingsport, but it's affected us in a positive way as far as individuals who've made a tremendous difference, positive difference. But also the lack of numbers has had an effect upon us as well. Yeah.
So we talked about, you mentioned the various championships, and that's changed over time how the state championship works. So could you tell us a little bit about Litkin House and how he was ranking teams?
Yeah. Dr. Litkin House was a chemical engineering professor at Vanderbilt, but I did some research on him. He played all the sports, major sports in high school. He knew something about sports, in other words. But he developed a mathematical formula to determine the rankings of state high school teams. And this started in 1941, and he would sell his rankings to newspapers throughout the state. And because you didn't have any AP or UPI rankings at that time, you didn't have any playoffs at that time, people took the Litkin House rankings seriously. I mean, that's how you determine the state champion. And he used some mathematical metrics to determine how he would rank the teams, but he kept it secret.
Yeah.
How he determined it. He said there is calculus involved. The only part of his formula that was revealed was that he did take into account difference in scores. Mm-hmm. If you beat a team by a large number of points, that would benefit you. Mm-hmm. And coaches just didn't like that at all, because that meant you had to run the score up on people. Mm-hmm. You needed to at times late in the year if you thought that made a difference in your ranking. There was one year DB won the state championship partly because they ran the score up on Science Hill. Mm-hmm. That's the reason they don't like us.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, they would have. I'm sure they would have done the same thing if they'd been in our shoes, but to get our final touchdown and make the final score look more respectable in the final minutes of the game, we're up by 2 or 3 touchdowns, and we're having double laterals. We're running trick plays to try to score. I mean, that would be unheard of today, but because of Lichtenhaus's rules, you had to do it. And that's one thing people didn't like. But it was a good thing he had it just to raise interest, to be able to declare you were state champions. And I don't think he was negative towards DB. We won 7 state championships while he was doing his ratings, along with the AP and UPI. They started in the 1950s. And, you know, if they declared us state champions, then I declared them state champions, you know, in my book. So,
sure.
Yeah.
He probably would be good at doing a fantasy football or something with all his calculations.
Oh, yeah.
I bet he would. Yeah. So the championship system changed in 1969. How did that change things? What were the consequences of that?
It made your goal in the regular season different in a way, in that now your goal was to get the highest seed possible for the playoffs. In other words, if you could win your conference, you'd be the number 1 seed. And when the playoffs started at first, only 2 teams from your region would be able to go to the playoffs. And at first, Region 1 went from here all the way to Knoxville. And that was really unfair for some of our really good teams that we had back in the 1970s when Tom Pugh and Fred Walton were head coaches. Coach Walton had 2 teams that went 9-1, and they didn't qualify for the playoffs, which, you know, by today's standards, they would have been there easily. And you never know what's going to happen once you get in the playoffs. So eventually, when they changed it from 2 teams to then a smaller region of 2 teams, basically your conference, then to 3 teams, I think that was 1993. And then they eventually went to 4 teams in your conference, where you had like 8 teams in your conference, usually 7 or 8 teams. That made it easier, but at the same time, you're still trying to just qualify for the playoffs. And, you know, we've had several times there where we were ranked number 1 in the state in your state rankings. And this is what's interesting. 4 different times, starting in 1990, we were the number 1 ranked team in the state in our division. Of course, before 1969, you had all the teams in the same division, if you want to call it that. You didn't have the different divisions. But then you started off with 3 divisions, then they went to 5, now they've got 6. But 4 different times, we were ranked number 1 in the class 6 division, but yet we got beat in the playoffs. If you don't have the playoffs, you could add those 4 teams to the 7 state championships we've got, and that would look impressive. But to be fair, if you'd had the playoffs before 1969, there's no guarantee all 7 of those teams would have won the state championship. But then again, there were teams that, you know, if you'd had as many teams in the playoffs as they had later on, they might have won state championships. So, yeah, you can sit there and argue about all that, what's good, what's bad. But it has, it did change things. And, you know, one thing I noted in the book, people, you know, a lot of people think, well, you know, we've not won a state championship since we went to the playoff system. But you know what? The overall winning percentage since 1969, when the playoffs started at DB, is 76%. The overall winning percentage from 1921, when we began playing football, to 1969 was 76%. Exactly the same.
Yeah.
So people need to keep that in mind too.
That's consistent.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed, I looked at the team records at the end of the book, and I noticed at some point there were no more tied games listed. Was that something that changed in the way that games were scored?
Well, they felt like they had to do that because now you had to declare a winner of each game in order to accurately seed people for the playoffs.
Sure.
It would just be a lot easier to do that. And you know, it was exciting too. I mean, it just added a feature that I think it made it more entertaining.
So is that like when overtime became a thing?
Yeah, for high school sports.
Yeah.
Yeah, high school football. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I guess, yeah. So, going back to like the record and stuff, I guess Lichtkenhouse can do all the math in the world, but there's always that human element, that you can't predict sometimes for predicting results. But that kind of makes me think about now towards the later part of the book, something that really struck me about both Ted Wilson and Graham Clark was their sense of perspective. I really liked reading about them. One exchange they had when Ted was coach and Clark was working there, Clark was frustrated. I guess they'd lost a game or something. And Wilson told him that the worst football job in America was better than the best assistant principal's job. Now, I've never been an assistant principal or a coach, but that resonates with me. It's that concept that, man, you know what? I may be having a bad day, but man, it could be so much worse. And I feel like Clark really took that to heart. And he made a similar observation. It was after 9/11. He was asked about feeling pressure, and he said, this is just a game. Pressure nowadays is deciding whether to open your mail. So obviously, you got to know football. You got to be technically good and to be a good coach. But I'm guessing that understanding people and each individual's context might be just as important for that. What was your impression of these two coaches and their approach to the program?
Well, I was there when they both were head coaches and admire both of them. That story with Ted Wilson was after in his first year as head coach. They were struggling the first part of the year, and they lost at Volunteer in a close game. The offense didn't play well. Graham Clark was the offensive coordinator. It's his first year. If you know anything about Graham, he's a competitor. And he, when things don't go well, he kind of wears his feelings on his sleeve, except in practice the next week when he's dealing with the players. And I'll get to that. But anyway, they get back to the school. The game was down at Volunteer, and Graham walks in the coach's office. They're going to sit around and shoot the bull for a while, and Ted's sitting there smiling. And Graham, well, what are you so happy about? Of course, Graham was frustrated because his offense didn't do well. And Ted said that about, head coaching job's easier than being an assistant principal. He'd been assistant principal, I think, for 1 year at Maryville, and he just didn't like it, But anyway, and the point, too, was Ted said, hey, it's okay. We'll come back tomorrow and we'll start getting better. And I think Ted, because of his strong religious faith, he kept things in perspective. He didn't let it run his day. He didn't let it run him, as far as the way he approached things. Graham, one of his assets, players told me, was, he hated to lose, hated it when his players he was responsible for didn't play well, but he would look at it also from a scientific standpoint. Well, what are we doing wrong? Now, he'd look at that film. He spent probably more hours looking at film than any football coach I've ever heard of. But he would analyze it to figure out what a kid's doing wrong and then correct it in practice the next week. And not necessarily berate a kid. I know that was one thing Coach Wilson stressed was, you're not going to get any more out of them by just berating them. You show them what they did wrong, move on, but hold them accountable too, but in the proper way. And that was something that made both of them successful, at what they did.
Yeah, I think understanding people and, I think that element of empathy that they expressed is so important.
Oh, yeah.
And especially when working with kids. Yeah. So, as I'm reading the book, and I don't have much familiarity with football, but I see different, staff positions mentioned. So what are the key coaching staff positions do you think are necessary for a successful football program?
I've never been a football coach. I was a baseball coach, but I have observed coaching staffs through the years. I think the most important people on your staff besides the head coach are your coordinators, offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator. And at the same time, your head coach is responsible for deciding what kind of scheme you're going to run, what kind of offense you're going to run, what kind of defense you're going to run. And in the end, it's his decision, but it's up to the coordinator to make sure it's all working. Now, you've got position coaches who deal running backs, receivers, linebackers, and so forth. But I think football lends itself more to important decisions by coaches that make a difference in winning and losing, maybe more than any other sport. Basketball, you can either shoot or you can't shoot. Baseball, you can either hit a baseball or you can pitch. I mean, you can teach them all the fundamentals, but, you can't scheme your way to win if you can't do the basics. But football, I think, involves with offensive formations, plays that you call, how you attack a defense. There is more thinking involved by coaches with their input having a bigger impact on what happens in a game. And the same thing defensively. How are you going to scheme up against a certain kind of offense? Darrell Watson was a great defensive coordinator at DB under Coach Clark. He would spend hours looking at film. I was told a story. He looked for hours. I think they were getting ready to play Elizabethton, just to study Elizabethton's defensive linemen to try to tell how much pressure they put with their fingers in the ground, which could give away whether they're going to, their offensive line, to give away whether they're going to pass protect or have a running play. Little things like that make a difference. But at the same time, the head coach decides what the offensive and defensive philosophy is going to be. But coaching makes a difference, I think, in football and as far as what you do. Although, as I said before, if you don't have the talent, there's just so much you can do. The talent is still, of the players, is still by far the most important ingredient.
They've got to be able to execute the plan, I guess, of the coach.
Oh, yeah.
So we've actually skirted on this a little bit. How did the success of the football program impact other sports in Kingsport?
It establishes an attitude in the school at the beginning of the year. If the football team does well, the basketball players are more excited about going to practice, about doing well. The fans are more excited about following the team. It carries over into spring sports. It's funny. I heard an administrator, non-athletic guy, say that one of the keys to having a good school year is for the football team to be good. I mean, it establishes an attitude in the school. And when they do well, you've got more positive vibes throughout the city. And that carries over into the other sports. The thing about pride carries over into those sports. And you can't underestimate the importance of motivation with high school kids. If they're excited about being there, if it makes a difference to them that they play for the Dobyns-Bennett Indians, you're more likely to have success. If there's negative stuff going around, and with social media being the way it is, once that negativism roots itself into the city, to society, boy, it's hard to knock. It's hard to get rid of that.
Yeah, I have to be very grateful that social media did not exist when I was in high school. Being a kid is hard enough without that. And I imagine that affects the football players too, and the coach. And, you've talked about is, someone can win a bunch of seasons and then they'll have a bad season and everyone's super critical. And it's like, well,
Yeah, I agree.
Just makes it harder.
Yeah.
Now, has the pandemic affected DB's program much, do you think? I guess everybody's program.
I don't think so. Last year was the year where the coaches really had to stress the idea of wearing a mask, social distancing, getting a vaccine.
Yeah.
Although those came out mainly after the football season was over.
Sure,
But still, they needed to show leadership as far as making sure the kids were doing right. And, it also affected practice. It also affected your meetings. You couldn't have mass meetings necessarily. You had to meet in smaller groups, for example. You had to be careful what you did in practice. McMinn County lost a playoff game to Dobyns-Bennett because they had a kid who was coming to the game who had COVID or who had been exposed to it, and they hadn't taken the proper precautions. They allowed the kid to come to practice, I think, early that week, and they ended up having to forfeit. I mean, but, you know, it was very tough on the coaches to handle everything they had to handle because of the pandemic.
Sure. I was going to say, we're getting towards the end of our time here. What do you hope readers will take away from this book, from reading this book?
I hope they see the uniqueness of the Dobyns-Bennett football program. Dobyns-Bennett has the second winningest program in the history of the state of Tennessee. Dobyns-Bennett has the 26th most successful program in the country. I hope they recognize we've had some notable individuals who've brought honor to Kingsport, people like Bobby Dodd, Bobby Cyphers, Cecil Puckett, the coaches we've had, Ed Shockey was so unique, and you know, the coaches that brought state championships as well, Howie Bowers, Bill Jasper in 59 and 60, Tom Brixey in 64. Graham Clark's been the longest serving and winningest DB coach in history. You know, I hope they recognize how fortunate the school program has been to have those kind of people. But also, I hope they appreciate the personalities of these people. And like I said, in the book, I tried to show odd things, unusual things, funny things that happened, stories that made us unique. There are stories in there I'm sure will make you laugh. There's a story or two that might make you cry. And but that's the human element. And I wanted to show that with this history.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can confirm there are all the feelings when reading the book. Does anybody in the audience have any questions?
Hey, Steve Edwards here. How you doing?
Hey, Steve. How you doing?
And Tracy.
And Tracy too.
Well, I see your picture, but
Here I am.
yeah, there you go.
You know what a good thing it is to have a historian like yourself that reminds us of this stuff and keeps the history alive. But I wanted to ask you, being a member of one of your baseball teams and a few golf teams, I'm wondering when the golf book's coming out and when the baseball book.
Well, I don't know about that, but I will keep that in mind.
You were a good baseball coach. Straight up.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and you know, it was a privilege to be a part of the athletic program there at DB, and you know, it's something you take pride in. And I think the difference in coaching compared to teaching, you know, in coaching you're with those kids 2 hours every day. In teaching, you're with kids 55 minutes every day, but you're not. You don't become as close to them. You don't work as just one-on-one like you do if you're coaching a sport. And that's the beauty of coaching. And that's why I think the relationship through the years between coaches and players is a little bit unique, because you just get to know each other better. And that's one thing from coaching I guess I most enjoy now, is just seeing people that I used to coach, talking to them, reliving the past, you know, just the fun things that happened, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, those were good times. Yeah.
Also, of course, you'll always be known as Iron Dave. Stephen Bradley says that all the time. Iron Dave is
Yeah, well, when Iron Dave started teaching the DB, he was 21 years old. I wasn't a whole lot older than the kids.
Oh, my goodness.
But, you know, the best teachers I had through all the years were also two of the toughest. My sixth grade teacher, Miss Hodge at Lincoln School, and my baseball coach, Coach Whiting. He was tough. He was very tough. But he got the most out of you, and he always kept you a little bit on edge. So when I'm waving that stick around in front of my classes, and You know, of course, I kind of did it as sort of a fun thing, and you know, but I did try to hold people accountable, and I thought they learned more if I did that. And I guess not adding any extra points to their grade, or not letting them do extra credit or curving grades, all that might have led to some of that Iron Dave stuff. But if I had it over, I'd do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember that from class, actually. You know, but I have to say, I think I made a B in the class, but I made a 5 on the exam, so it paid off.
What it's all about. That's yeah, that's great. That's great.
Made me do the work.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everyone for coming. If you're interested, we do have the book at the library. Oh, we have a question over here.
Dave.
Yeah.
This is Bill Hale.
Yeah, how you doing?
Pretty good.
Good.
I'm just blown away about the deepness of your research on this.
Well, thank you.
And I'm not a Kingsporter, but going through that, I have known or worked with a lot of people that were mentioned in the book as players on DB football.
Yeah.
And I'm just amazed. I didn't know that. I know you did.
Yeah.
But this had to be a painstaking dive into history.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
What's your next book going to be on baseball?
I'm not planning on anything anytime immediately. I want to take a break. I got into this because I'd always been thinking about doing it. I had the time to do it, and I've enjoyed it. I really have enjoyed it. But I may do something in the future. But no, I'm going to give myself a little bit of a break right now anyway.
Well, congratulations on a job well done.
Well, thank you, Bill. Thank you.
Well, if we want him to write some more, we need to buy his stuff. So I was going to say, you can buy his book at the mall in the I Love Bookstore. You can check it out from the library, or there's www.wordofmouthpress.us. His book is published right there.
Yeah, and I've also got my own website, DBFTBALL, in other words, DB Football abbreviated. 100 years YRS at gmail.com. And anybody that contacts me who lives here in the Kingsport area, I can hand deliver a book. Just I can make it simple.
There you go.
So just contact me directly through that website, and I can take care of that.
How many people can say they got their book hand delivered by an author? There you go.
Yeah.
Talk about service.
Hey, will you say that again? DB Football 100 years.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just spell it out. Let's see. DBFTBALL 100 YRS at gmail.com.
It's the number 100.
Yeah, that's the number 100.
All right, thank you all. Thank you for this hour. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, folks, and asking good questions.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Bye.
Well, thanks for coming, everyone, and thanks for writing the book.
Okay, thank you.
Y'all have a good night.
Okay, thank you.